Okay, welcome everyone. Yeah, we're trying to keep the people out of the church. It's new ministry. Okay, well, I'm glad you're here. A lot of people are going to end up seeing that we're filming, so we're going to act as though, well, we're not acting, we're just moving forward. Let's start with a word of prayer. If one generation, Lord, is to proclaim your greatness and your power to another, then continue to show us the most effective means in which to do so, that we may understand better, that we may have greater insight, that we may be wise like a serpent and even gentle like a dove. Help us to that end in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, welcome. For the last 3 weeks, 3 sessions, we have looked at our culture. We've looked at the younger generations. We've defined these generations. We've looked at the distinctives about these generations, and then we've looked at practical ways in which to better relate with these generations. And today we have a unique perspective. David Parrish, our youth director, is here, student youth director, and he comes by way of, he's a graduate of UNC Greensboro and with a degree in English, and he taught English in the public high school for 10 years and coached soccer. And then we found out what a great guy he was, so we snagged him and brought him over here.
Amen.
And we are seeking to build a youth ministry. Now, a little bit of history. I was a youth minister at one time in late 90s, 96, 97, in quite a different context. And I share this because I want you and all of us to be reminded of how much change has taken place in the younger generations that we minister to today than even 25 years ago. Now granted, it was a little larger pool to choose from, a little larger church. I had 30 different high schools represented by 100 different students on a weekly basis. And so many of these kids were coming to Christ left and right that our biggest problem was how to disciple them and how to get them to worship services on retreats as often as we could. Didn't even matter. They got so ravenous for God, they just wanted to go to any state park that was available, and all they wanted was some instruments and to worship. Fast forward 25 years to today, and we have quite a different landscape. In the late 90s, God was moving in a very unique and quite distinctive and powerful way in our country, in many pockets of our country and in the church. And today we find ourselves with some real challenges of trying to understand the culture and minister the gospel to them. And I say this because we need to see this through a modern day, current youth ministers' day-to-day trench perspective, because our grandchildren may not be dealing with some of the stuff we talk about today, but don't be mistaken for 1 second that they're not exposed to and influenced by the things that we're going to share today that are complex and that are troubling. I'm just giving you a warning. And we want to look at the reality of what it means to minister to this younger generation as a church and as parents and grandparents. Okay, that having been said, I want to talk about, I asked David earlier today, I said, let's talk about some of the main areas of challenging ministry, the challenge ministry, and complicate life for young people today. And the first he came up with was boundaries and supervision of our young people and their access to social media and the internet. So the question is, David, to what extent, we'll start with, at what age typically are our children getting their first cell phone and having unfettered, for the most part, unfettered access to the internet? What would you say that, when is that taking place?
Well, I'm honored to be here, everyone, and thank you for coming. God bless you for seeking wisdom from me, so that's an honor as it is. And so with that, cell phones probably average around 12, 11 years old, so middle school, Some parents don't hold off till high school. Other kids have them in 3rd, 4th grade. So it really depends on the youth that is being dealt with in the family structure. So you're looking at around 11 or 12 years old. They've got access to an entire world of grace, an entire world of problems. And like you're saying, the number one problem that Kelsey and I, or a priority that I think the church and our families really need to step in is, I was telling Gary earlier that the internet is like Central Park. And we've developed as a culture that it's okay for kids to have just unfettered access in Central Park. And so what we do is we give them this device, and then we don't train them, we don't teach them, we don't walk with them. And they've got access to the jazz musician playing this beautiful song, and they've also got access to the dark tunnel where all sorts of dangerous things happen. And there's many different mediums that they can reach that through. It's not just even the cell phone, it's through your TVs now, even kids' tablets, everything that has access to the internet, there's a way for something to come at them, whether it's through, like, even with my youngest, we watch this show Bluey, which we love, but it's still, if we're parents and we're not supervising even TV shows at this point, culture has just shifted so drastically from the biblical evangelical viewpoint that as Christians, we really need to be careful and monitor and preview and just be there as our children, as our youth are engaging in all these activities, and train them up from a young age. And what's happened in a lot of circumstances is they get this cell phone at 11 and 12 years old, and there hasn't been any training. There's been no guidance, and so now they're left to kind of, maybe a few monitors have been put in place, if you're lucky. If you're out there and you need some services to help you. In my family, we've got, our internet is restricted as it is. There's certain websites you can't go to, but then there's also programs and software that you can put on your phone, such as Bark or Covenant Eyes, and things that can help you as a parent see and keep accountability for this access to the internet. And so there is a great blessing that comes from it. Cell phones aren't evil, but there's still danger there. Central Park is not evil. It can be really beautiful and really wonderful, but we as parents, as neighbors, we need to make sure that we're building up a relationship with our youth, that they're comfortable walking through Central Park with us, that they believe that we're there to trust, to help them, to protect them, and any boundaries that we set up is just for their own guidance. And so that for any new parents that are coming up that have younger kids, if you start now, by the time they're 11 and 12, and you've really got to handle some darker issues, and you're engaging in deeper, more mature stuff, they're going to be more likely to listen to your heeding voice if this has been a walk you've been on the entire time, instead of, oh, I saw you look at this one thing that's dangerous, now all these blocks and all these no's are coming into your life, and now, oh yeah, there's also this church thing attached to these no's, and so it's really off-putting. And so that would, yeah, any questions
In
about
previous
that?
sessions, we talked about a grandparent. Sometimes grandparents, if they're not careful, will self-deprecate, and they'll posture themselves in a relationship with a grandson or granddaughter to where they're very needy. Okay, so in the area of technology, perhaps we come across this, I don't really know enough about this, I really need your help with this, and you have a younger person helping the grandparent. That's needy. We can't afford to appear to be needy. We have to focus on how we can be more needed. Okay? So if a grandparent can come to the point where they're needed and essential in a young person's life, we've made it halfway there. One thing a grandparent cannot do in this culture, cannot do it, is be naive. So I want to ask a couple questions about this. Christian or non-Christian, okay? Two different worldviews. You see both. Is one of those two categories protecting their children from access to the internet more than another, or at the end of the day, is it pretty much the same?
So I'm a little biased because I engage a little bit more with the Christian community, particularly Christian parents, but there are parents out there that are also monitoring. But by and large, most of the youth's engagement is not monitored. As a teacher, there was constantly problems, and no parents wanted to kind of step in and put on blocks or have these hard conversations, because it is hard, right? You would literally be drawing a line and saying, we're doing this, and your other 25, 30 classmates are not doing this. And because they're not, it's just not happening in any of the classrooms and the school does it, but from that classroom perspective, during break, I get to see what's on everyone's phone, and there's no real monitoring going on. There's no real accountability, and it's just really tough. And so whenever you make that stand as a parent or you make that stand as a grandparent, there's serious pushback that they're going to have, not only from their own self, but from all their peers. They're going to be ostracized. And so it's a tough battle, because you have to decide, what line are you going to draw? What's this going to be? Am I going to ostracize my child here for his own safety? And that's where it really comes in, that you need to start this young so they understand that it's a protection, it's a love thing. It's not I'm a mean bully thing.
Okay, so let's make a connection between online lack of boundaries or access and identity. Because identity at a middle school age right now really appears to be informed and influenced by one's worthiness or perceived lack of worthiness in a social media setting or an online setting. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, explain that, because identity formation at that age is crucial. So this idea of never being good enough, the comparing and contrasting that goes on, and the interaction that takes place on the internet for a youngster is how is it panning out? What do you see happening?
So just an oversimplification, and most kids get introduced to online media around 6th or 7th and 8th grade, and they're kind of navigating it naively. And by the time they make 9th grade, they've made now a commitment. They've made a stance. They've taken a stance with whatever the culture they were raised in, whether that was Christian, whether that was non-Christian. They've generally had enough influence from the content they're looking at to make a decision that is going to be very impactful in their life by the time they hit 9th grade. So from a youth standpoint, I see the biggest turnover of kids who don't come back to church between 8th and 9th grade. That's whenever the full-on, because at 9th grade, most of the culture of 9th grade is totally enveloped in whatever is out there in social media, whatever content is being put out there. So at that point, when you're a 9th grader and you come in and you say, I'm a Christian, or you say, I'm going to stand, there's going to be an ultimate feed or pushback that you're going to have against everything. So that's not even just saying we're not even getting into sexuality, we're not getting into gender, we're not getting into all these other things. Just by doing that alone in 9th grade, there's this huge identity. So people that are raised in a church or raised in Christianity, culture does not really come in line with that, especially in the public school and even in the private Christian schools. It's just not there. So all this to say, I look at it from a Christian lens, but I didn't become a Christian until much later in life. But so it's 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. Any values that your family has instilled into your child, whatever it is going to be directly assaulted from 6th, 7th, and 8th grade to a point where right around 9th grade, there's going to be a decision that's going to have to be made, because they're going to have to either go against the crowd or bow to the crowd, generally around 9th grade. And so it's those 6th, 7th, and 8th grade years are so pivotal that there is love, that there is guidance, that they can form the identity that Christ is good, that Christ loves me, or that culture is not necessarily to be believed in everything. That if that doesn't happen, then there's some serious lies that seep in and kind of root themselves by 9th, 10th, 11th grade, whenever the real onslaught comes in of culture.
Yeah. So in previous weeks, we've talked about two key words: deconstruct and deconvert. The deconstruction of one's faith is the asking of questions that really need to be answered in authentic ways. And I think I'm starting to see more and more at this middle school and early high school age, this deconstruction of what these children have been taught as their faith of their family is in process. And it can be a good or a bad process. The good process is they're asking questions and their faith is building because they're getting answers about their faith. The bad process is they're unduly influenced by, from the outside, into any and every area of life, and if the family isn't there and the identity isn't formed yet, they're deconstructing their faith. And I'm seeing more and more, it's becoming earlier and earlier into it. We call adulthood, used to call it 18. Now, I think 18, the modern day 18, adulthood is really, 23, 24. And I would say that it's probably going to end up being 27, 28 before it's over. Emerging adulthood in the 90s is what I dealt with. What you're dealing with now is these kids are finding real life adult temptations at a much earlier age because of access, and it's blowing up their identity and their actual definition of who they are and what they believe much earlier. They're being picked off, really. So, okay, let's talk a little bit about to give you, you may not even realize, well, yeah, I'm sure you do. Same-sex attraction in a high school 25, 30, 35, 40 years ago, if you experienced any thought along that line, you certainly wouldn't talk about it. You would be ostracized to the max. Now it's the opposite.
Correct.
So talk to us about what heterosexual male and heterosexual female students now are referring to themselves as and why, and this will give you an idea of the pressure that's being put to bear through social media.
Yeah, I think pressure is the right word there. So, yeah, it would be uncomfortable now for most males or females to identify as a heterosexual in today's culture, especially in that high school culture, and college definitely, because so now what I'm seeing more and more when you look at chats and you look at forums, there's a heterosexual male is tempted to identify as a pansexual, which means that you are attracted to who you're attracted to. And so it doesn't put any judgment, it doesn't put any identification on on who or what or if you like anything. And so what it does is it just takes this because culture's coming and they're looking at you and they're wanting to judge, are you for us or are you against us? And so when you say pansexual, you're saying you can do whatever you want, and I like the opposite sex, but I'm going to identify as a pansexual. So that way I don't have to.
You create an umbrella for yourself
right.
in which not to be ridiculed. So as not to openly disagree with someone else's preference. You
right.
call yourself something you're actually vague enough they don't really know.
Right.
So it's all about tolerance.
Yeah, and not everyone does that. That's just the temptation to do that, because you can avoid a lot of confrontation, you can avoid a lot of isolation by throwing that out there. It's a new safe word, I guess you could say. It's culturally friendly, it's culturally relevant, it's non-threatening. So
it's vague, yeah. It can be vague.
Yeah, and so we were kind of talking about it, the tolerance there is intolerant almost at this point, which you guys I'm sure know and have experienced, and I've experienced that as well. But then the drastic difference is, even when I was in high school, there was lesbian and other homosexual relationships, transsexuality. All that was there, but it was not very prevalent in high school. I think I knew even in Highlands, I knew 2 lesbians or women that identified as lesbian. In college, I was friends with a transsexual person, so it was there. But also the school I went to is pretty groundbreaking. It was known for inviting that type of lifestyle to anybody that wanted to explore would go to UNCG, and so. But from now until then, I can't even imagine what it looks like now. And so now in Highland schools, there's transsexuality involved. There's all sorts of things going on that our kids are facing day to day. If you look at Netflix kids shows, it's in there. You look at wherever you're looking, sexuality and gender identity is being challenged and being encouraged to explore from the minute you can get eyes on screen. And so that's why, going back to supervision, it's, you can take the route of we're not watching any TV, or you can step up as a parent, step up as a grandparent, and engage and walk your children through this, walk your youth through this. And it is a battlefield that they're entering. That all screen time is just, we've been very complacent as a culture. It's because it's easy to. It's a babysitter. It's mindless. You can numb it off, but we are losing a war, an important war for identity with our youth, whether they're Christian or non-Christian. And what I mean when I say we're losing a war is we're allowing somebody else to teach our children what is right and what is wrong and who they are. And it's going unchallenged. So whether you're watching this and you are a Christian or whether you're watching this and you're not a Christian, it's still important to know that you need to speak into your kids and have conversations of, is this normal? Is this okay? Is this healthy? What does that look like? And that, if you start that at a young age, which here in a year or two, I'm going to have my lyric, he'll be 4 years old, we'll have to really engage this and say, this is what happens, but this is where we go. So,
yeah. You know, education is, what young people need in their life are people that are relevant. And to be relevant, we need to communicate frequently, and we need to be able to be educated on such things. So just in the last few minutes, what did we learn? There's an entire language that's being taught that if we don't know what the language is, we know the intent behind it. How can we communicate about these things if we don't even know the language? When I was in youth ministry, which I had a deep passion for, I would think to myself, how am I supposed to make a difference in someone's life if they come to 2.5 youth worship services a month, okay? So 2.5 a month would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 4.5 hours over a month's period of time. And in the 4.5 hours, half of that time, a half hour each night, they were playing games. There was another 15 minutes at the end of the evening they were hanging out with each other. There was probably an hour and a half of potential time in which to influence that kid in a direct way, with scripture, in worship, in that kind of environment. And we're competing with screen time 15, 20, 30 hours a week.
I mean, probably more like 8-9 hours a day, really.
So it's a disproportional just time allocation of influence to someone whose mind is already impressionable. And here we are thinking, we're like swatting at flies we don't even know what we're doing. And so you made a comment earlier today that a pastor mentioned Facebook to a group of young people this weekend. And why was that humorous? It was
disastrous, actually. It defeated. So Facebook is dead for the youth. And so to mention Facebook, we went to this awesome conference. I'm just going to shout out to Summer Surge. They did a great job. Our kids were really impacted. It was really awesome. But just to be out of touch and just to compare a Facebook reference to these youth I was telling you, that's 3 softwares behind where the kids are at right now. So, they were on Facebook, then they were on Instagram, they're off that now, and they're on TikTok, and they're off that, and they're really on Snapchat now is the main one. And so by mentioning Facebook, you've really missed the mark, right? You've put a dent in your relationship before you've even started.
You've showed your ineptness.
Yeah, it's a dead platform that we love and I love and we use. But
that would be like saying today, I'm going to go out today and look for a new gremlin.
Right.
I'm going to get an Edsel or a gremlin, AMC gremlin, or Pinto, Ford Pinto. You don't even know what a Ford Pinto is, do you?
I do. But yeah, Vint, yeah, it's only because it was cool, not because I grew up with it. But yeah, so that, just for anyone listening, right, like the primary way our youth communicate right now is through this app called Snapchat, which it's really a brilliant platform. You can navigate and see, like if I pulled up Snapchat right now, I could see exactly where my wife was and who was with her. And then on top of that, I can now send, so if I text them through the Messenger app that we all use, they're going to already look at me and be like, gosh, I got to open up Messenger. So they want to communicate through Snapchat. And the problem with Snapchat for me as a Christian is there's not much accountability that comes along with it. And so when you send a message via Snapchat, it erases immediately, right? And so you send a message on or a picture or a video or whatever it is, it erases immediately. So culture is already, for someone that's trying to invest in kids and really protect and shield and monitor and guide, Snapchat's a hard battle. It's a really hard battle. And so mostly it's, to me personally, I don't recommend any of my youth have it. And that's a problem because now they're one of 20 that don't have this way to communicate. But it's also like you don't hand a 6-year-old a gun. You know, it can be very dangerous, and there's lots of, it's the rec park without any supervision is what it is. A bunch of kids hanging out with no one to check them. And so
as a result of, and it sounds like we're trying to scare everybody. I don't think we are. I think we're being fairly realistic.
Yeah, this is just reality, right? Like this is the battle, and these are hard conversations that you need to have with your spouse, with your children, on what does our family look like, and how do we navigate an ever-changing social media world where there is lots of danger, while as well there's lots of blessing that can come through it. And at what age is appropriate for us to move them on to the next level? Where does freedom come in? And it needs to be taken very, very seriously.
I get this picture sometimes of the naivete of a parent looking at a child and thinking they're 13, 14, 15 years old, and then they're going to high school and it's off to college, and you think to yourself, "What did we do a good job?" Not in every case, but sometimes you just want to say, you realize, wait a minute, you're like 4 years behind. Do you have any idea who that young person thinks they are and how far off you may be from how they've already been influenced at this point? You think they're still developing. They decided a long time ago, if left unchecked and allowed to be influenced in a lot of ways. Not a lot, not every time, but often. Okay, so the consequences of, and I'm not here to say that everything on social media is bad. That's a stupid thing to say. There's some very wonderful things out there, very positive things, uplifting things. There's great material out there. But the problem is, even if your son or daughter, grandson or granddaughter are filtered and not able to access those things, they got 12 friends who aren't. Yeah, all right, so let's be realistic here. Having said that, what are some of the consequences of communicating digitally in everyday life? What do you see? I think you got some social ramifications, face-to-face, and confrontation issues. What do you see going on with that?
So it's the main thing that I noticed is there's a lot less hard conversations that take place because you can, via social media, you can drop something on somebody and then never really have to engage because a lot of the engagement that goes on is with complete strangers. So there's this no real consequence for what you say beyond just people see it. And with Snapchat, there's really no consequence. So it allows for a great exploration. You can really navigate who you are and what person you want to be. Is this appropriate behavior? Is this what I want to engage in? And B, it also kind of allows you to not really experience consequences for actions. And so what I've seen mainly through teaching in that perspective is that there is a much less openness to come speak to authority. So when there was problems as a teacher, they would be hard-pressed for a child to come talk to me directly unless they had really been navigated their whole life and encouraged to do that. So I spent a lot of time talking to senior parents and not seniors. And so that's probably the biggest kind of detriment of this online communication is that we can develop these complacencies to not really have to engage in the tougher things of life. And not necessarily need to engage in the hard conversations would be what I would say.
Would you say that young people are more reticent to establish new social relationships face to face?
I don't know if I would say that yet. It's easier, and if you're the cool thing about social media is if you're rejected in high school, which we all can look back through our high school experience and see people that were rejected, is there's now a place for them to find comfort, and there's now a place for them to find family, and so that's a beautiful thing. But it's also, we as parents want to come in and say, is there a place that's safe for them to find family on there? So just because they're having a good time and they've got friends does not necessarily mean that all is healthy and well. It can be incredibly healthy, but it can also be incredibly dangerous as well. So, but I think that there's still this, even with the youth group, I see it, there's something that, like, I don't care how far we get into technology, you put kids on a basketball court or outside playing, they're going to love it. That desire is still there. But it's with any addiction, right? Phones, we're all addicted to these phones. I'm addicted. If you give me a choice to get up and do something or look at my phone, I'm going to look at my phone. And so as grandparents, as parents, as friends, it's really important that we create opportunities for them to disengage with their cell phones, to disengage with the screen. And so if I only had a limited number of time that I was able to spend with the youth, I would not be anywhere near a phone, and I would be trying to do some sort of activity that's outside, that they love, that is completely off that, where you can meet them where they are and provide a different outlet, because they do love it, but it's just not offered as much as it was before. So,
all right, let's talk about this. We talked about this earlier, and I was kind of fascinated by it, actually. This idea of mental illness. First of all, do you deal with depression a lot? Not you personally, but with younger people.
Yeah, it's so. I don't want to quote this stat because I don't know it offhand, but I believe that depression's on an all-time high, and I don't know what that number is. And if you do, just let us know, and I'm sorry I didn't prepare that beforehand. But yes, the depression is running rampant, and it is because there is all these interactions that are taking place in a closed bedroom where there's no one to notice that someone's hurt, that there's no one to notice that they were left out, that there's no one to notice that they feel like they're not good enough. And so that interaction, which is the number one way that youth interact, it's online through chat forums or Snapchat or on Instagram or via TikTok videos. There's all these interactions that they're taking place that are coming in and speaking identity into them. And there's no one, again, it's all back to boundaries and identity. And there's no parental to come in or friends to come in and speak to that. So depression is just skyrocketed, right? And a lot of it is due to buried comments, right? Someone says something online and there's no one to help walk them through, well, does that identity get to land on me? Is that really who I am? Does the whole world think this about me? Am I really this failure? And it's all buried deep in over and over again. And I can't remember the stat, but it's something like every positive comment, or it's like 100 positive comments to one negative comment. And it's roughly that. So I don't necessarily believe that everyone's out there butchering people on social media, but they're getting negative comments, and then they're having to process it without anyone to help walk them through that. And
what would you use the word maturity stagnation the other day, or this afternoon? What did you mean by that?
Maturity stagnation?
Yeah.
Oh man, I was really on it, I guess. So I'm not sure what I meant by that.
Okay, did the last 2 years of COVID, we're speaking in generality, the last 2 years of COVID with the shutdown of schools or limited school, how do you think that affected people from a social standpoint, especially younger people?
Well, I think it affected very negatively. I really, I couldn't speak. I'm not a psychologist or anything like that, but just from what I've seen, the depression that came back through the engagement from the youth was really, there's a lot of confusion, there was a lot of depression, there was a lot of just non-worth that was given. So you've got certain kids need to be outside, certain kids need to be interacting face to face because that's where they thrive and they find success and they get the attaboys that they've been needing their whole life. But COVID killed that. And so it turned everything social, or social media, which can be social. And so it just created this environment that if you were, whoever you were before COVID, now you've got to create this new identity, and you have to sink everything into it, because you're not allowed to engage your best friend anymore hand to hand. So now you've got to create this new identity online, and you have to hope people like you. And so there was a lot of shifts that had to take place there, because in the end of the day, and you preach this a lot, that we're all just wanting to be accepted. And COVID shifted that drastically. So it was an earthquake in what would be a developing life.
Depression is actually at an all-time high among adolescents right now. And as a grandparent, gosh, I'm having to think through this right myself. I have a 10 and an 8-year-old grandchildren. And I'm asking myself, do I have the kind of relationship with them to where if they were in trouble, or they thought they would get in trouble if they talked to their own parents, would they come to me or my wife? That's a fair question to ask. Am I understanding enough? Do I know what questions to ask them about how they are? When I came up here to this mountain, I was faced with suicidal ideation among adolescents and adults, frankly, that was so far beyond what I had seen in a larger city. In addition to that, some of the youth were starting to cut themselves, and that whole phenomenon kind of, I think that's kind of gone down some, but that was in vogue for a while.
It's there.
It's still there, okay.
It's aggressively there now.
All right, well, this idea that you can get addicted to your own endorphins, and that to experience a physical pain less than your emotional pain is kind of a haunting thing. But you mentioned something also earlier today about mental illness being in some ways in our culture in vogue, that it's a positive thing to have a mental illness or a disorder or a condition. So elaborate on that, because that's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, that's actually a great jumping off point. So like that culture of cutting and all that, before, if you were a cutter, you were isolated. You were a cutter in your school and you were the only one. But now there's a place where you can land, where you can find like-minded people. And so at base level, that's really good. The problem is in that community now that's formed, it's all sponsoring and supporting this idea of these endorphin reliefs, and it's supporting pushing limits. And so that's kind of where it all started, is these little pocket communities online were great. Like, it was a great idea. People wanted friends, they wanted acceptance, and so they found it, and they found like-minded people that were suffering from suicidal thoughts, cutting problems, multiple personality disorders, all these real problems, and they found a community that was not necessarily helping with the problems, but finding love, but encouraging the behavior at the same way. So that's kind of where it all started, and now it's kind of leapt out of there, and it's becoming more mainstream to where mental disorders are now promoted and celebrated and encouraged. And it's almost like if you can carry trauma, or you have a mental disorder, or there's something wrong with you that happened, you can celebrate that on social media, and it actually it like levels you up in the eyes of everybody. And so, which is really dangerous, because instead of addressing the root, celebrating is good, right? Let's get past the trauma. Let's preach. Let's put Jesus in there and heal it. Or if you're not a Christian, let's heal it. Let's walk you through it and heal this thing. But instead, it's become this thing where this victim mentality is okay, and it's lift me up because I deserve to be lifted up, and it's really dangerous. So the latest thing that Kelsey and I were seeing was that there's just this multiple personality disorder that everybody is claiming. And it's scary, because you've got kids that really have multiple personality disorders that are suffering, and then you've got others that are trending and picking up on it. And so it's this really unstable environment that has been created, where those that are actually suffering no longer have a community. Everybody's got multiple so it's this weird interaction that's going on.
At some level, it's attention-getting kind of.
Yeah, it's turned into that. So you can.
Like-mindedness, attention-getting, empathy, sympathy.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So why do we go into all this detail about all of this stuff? Because none of us are actually. We're all affected by the world we live in on some level. And the younger you are, and the more impressionable you are, and the more drastic some of these behaviors become, the more impressionable we can be. So the real question is, who's helping, who's supporting, who's the team around a grandson or a granddaughter that is aware of, and it's not naive, like totally oblivious to these issues. And to me, it comes down to it, and we're going to have some questions here in a minute, so if you got anything you want, or comments you want to bring up. It wasn't too awful long ago, I wrote my thesis, and the title of this thesis was a paragraph, basically. The most effective way to evangelize postmodern collegiates that are unabashedly sexually active. So my thought was, how do you best reach a generation of college students that are unabashedly sexually active? And part of that is defined as addiction to pornography, access and addiction. So I formed, as my statistics bear out, I formed questionnaires that I gave to hundreds of college students. And I asked a series of questions about who they are, what their beliefs were, whether they had a holy book, did they have a religious practice, are they an atheist, are they sexually active, they have multiple partners, do they same-sex attraction, do you view pornography, if so, how many hours a week, multiple choice questions. And I got a profile. And then I showed them 4 videos, each about 3.5 to 4 minutes long. And after those videos, I asked additional questions. I first ascertained if they were open to hearing the gospel of Jesus Christ, or if they knew who he was, were you opposed to him. And what I wanted to do is measure which video content changed and opened their mind and heart to the gospel. That's what I was looking for, and why. And there was one particular video that had to do with Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal painting, where the prodigal son returns and he's on his knees, tattered clothes, shoeless on one foot, and he wraps his arms around the father and his ear is on the sternum or the heart of his father. And I explained the painting to them and the symbolism in the painting. And statistically, with the help of a clinical psychologist, statistically I came to the conclusion that the number one reason someone opened their heart and mind to the gospel who was engaged unabashedly in sexual activity was the phrase, coming home to the heart of the Father. That was the phrase that made the most difference. And when you drill down on the answer to subsequent other questions, the real result was that they felt a sense of shame, a less thanness, an unworthiness. And they were like Cinderella. They were looking any and everywhere they possibly could for validation, even through escapism and fantasy and a number of things. And I'll never forget the girl that made the most difference with had been looking at pornography, I couldn't believe this, 15 to 17 hours a week. It was like a part-time job. And that was a common answer among collegiate students. And she was attracted to women, and she had rejected any kind of religion. And she was the number one responder to being open to the gospel based on the embracing of a father. And I thought, my gosh, I was ecstatic because I had hit on something. The gospel in the first century church was presented and it was received by people in a different way than we both present and receive it today. We think that people want forgiveness of their sin. And in the first century, what people wanted was the removal of shame. They wanted forgiveness, and Jesus knew that. But they lived in a shame-honor culture. What that meant was, Asian cultures are this way even today. If you sin, you are actually ruining the reputation of your family or your clan, and you're dishonoring your family. This is why it says in Hebrews 12 and 2, fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who on the cross did what? Scorned our shame. So all of this horrible stuff that we've discussed tonight, it all centers around this one thing. There is embedded in an entire generation and generations a deep abiding sense of shame. And no matter how we paint it or what we reel against or how we interact with the world, at the end of the day, your grandson and your granddaughter, your son and your daughter, they need a reliable, relevant voice in their life that protects them and speaks whatever is needed to them to alleviate shame.
Yep.
That is it. At the end of the day, that's it. You can get all the software and protective things on your devices or not get a cell phone until you're 45 years old, but you still have to deal with shame. And social media is the playground for either intensifying a sense of shame or keeping it neutral or doing away with it, depending. Why would a culture want the forgiveness of sin if there are no absolutes? Why? If we tolerate everything, what do we need forgiveness for? You see how irrelevant the gospel is to a generation who perceives it to be that way.
Right.
If I tolerate everything you do and you tolerate everything I do, neither one of us are sinning, right? Because there's no absolute. So if we constantly are out there saying, you need the forgiveness of sin, the forgiveness of sin, yes, they do, but what they need first is someone to say, you don't have to walk around with this shame anymore. You've heard me say this before, it goes right down to it. What does every son need to hear from their father? And if their father's not telling them this, you tell them. You have what it takes to be the man God's called you to be. Any kid, and this is why athleticism is so high and such a big deal up here. It's one of the few activities, but it's where they form their identity and their approval, right?
Yeah,
You can actually
definitely
be a hero. In a small town like this, you could be a big fish in a small pond.
Yep.
Athletics will do that for you. And there's not many other choices, which is the problem. Second thing is, what does every little girl need to hear from their father? Sweetie, you're beautiful just the way you are, and you're worthy of pursuit. You've basically demonstrated a girl's worth in 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade when she's doing nothing but comparing and contrasting herself to any and every image she sees online. So it really comes down to shame. And it comes down to fact, is a grandparent educated, needy, or needed? Relevant or irrelevant? And do you have a voice? Have you earned the opportunity to speak? We can tell them not to do all stinking day long, and just like God did for centuries, and we did the opposite. We can say, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We can say, don't go online, don't go to that website. We can say all of that, and then that's what they're going to do. Or we can start to alleviate whatever shame is in their life for whatever reason, and they won't have a need for those things in their life. There it is. So anyway, that's a little bit of a very depressing look at our culture. Not saying all of us have children and grandchildren that are engaged in that behavior, but we're all influenced by it, directly and indirectly. Your life is influenced by it. So is mine. And I want to thank you for your diligence and faithfulness to hang in there in a job I wouldn't want. 25 years ago, it was a cake job, man. Now it's for real. So anyway, anybody have any questions, any comments, any criticism, any ridicule, anything you want to share? Anybody else? Okay.
There's a microphone right up here.
Or I'll repeat it if you want to. Go ahead. Okay, I'll give you one on the internet and smartphones and that whole dynamic of influencing a young person online. And I'm trying to think of his first name. Last name is Cynic. He's written 5 books at present. He's probably he doesn't come at it necessarily from a secular standpoint nor a Christian, but he knows what he's talking about. You'll see him at Catalyst conferences and church-wide type conferences. He's written 5 books. The last 2, I believe, are on that very subject. He would be a great resource to understand the influence sociologically and neurologically of the internet and most of the cell phone. I would throw the Bible in there, and it's his first name. Do you know Cynic? I think it's S-I-N-E-K. Yeah,
No.
he's the authority on that subject.
Are you talking about just like what is relevant today, like what the kids are engaging in today? Yeah. Yeah, so culture right now is basically influenced by TikTok is the number one influencer of what is going on. So that is the loudest voice that the teens are hearing from. And TikTok broadcasts over multiple platforms. So if you got Facebook and you look on there for the videos, what you're watching is products of TikTok. So that's accessible through Instagram and Snapchat as well, YouTube. So all the platforms connect back. And so really the number one thing is TikTok right now is the big influencer that everyone is kind of navigating through. And then so the other one that you really want to, download it, go get a Snapchat, get a TikTok and play with it. It's not, it may be a little bit foreign to you, but it's pretty self-explanatory. You can walk through it if you have a little patience. So just those 2 right now, if you wanted to, get a TikTok, get a Snapchat, and just see, just what are they looking at, and then if you realize you're addicted, get off it.
Simon Sinek is the name. Yeah, he's a Brit. Mm-hmm. Good question. Anything else? This grandparent thing, it's work. So, this is a lot of work just to keep up. Yeah. Sure.
There were boundaries. When I was a kid, we sat down with the family, we had a meal, we asked each other how your day was. I'd say, Dad, how was your day at the office? He was in the newspaper business. How was your day on the baseball field? We don't talk to our kids anymore like that.
Yep.
Or our grandkids. And to me, we lost, I don't know. I don't know how to like this, but Satan is alive and well out there. Just a
Well, you bring up a good point. You've heard me talk about this. We have a retired professor from Georgia Tech in our congregation every Sunday. And I asked him a question recently. I said, well, what's the number one issue? He goes, he told me what he taught. He goes, that's my subject I'm hired to teach, but I don't really teach it. I go, what do you mean? He goes, I teach critical thought. No matter what my subject I'm hired to teach is, because these kids can't think. And I just finished a project. I'm very close to finishing a project, and what I want to take on next is holding classes on critical thought and identifying fallacies of thought in argument. But if you'll pay attention, most every Sunday, I will drop a comment or two into a sermon about thinking, because I think it's not just the younger generation. I see older generations having given up on thought. Yeah, I mean, I talked about abortion the other day, and I've had, I don't know how many conversations with people who thought it was a revelation. I never thought about that. And I'm thinking to myself, why don't you? Why haven't you? If there's going to be more children aborted, we need to have more adoptions, more Christian families, more influence. I mean, let's think ahead. But yeah, thought is an endangered species in our culture, and we really need to think about that. Think about it.
Yeah. So, first thing is like they're trained really, they want quick stimulation is what it is. So when you sit a kid down at the dinner table and say, "How was your day?" That's boring. You know, that can be, but it doesn't have to be. It just requires a little bit of thought, like you're talking about from us. And how do we, so they want quick stimulation, but there's no depth. But if you give them depth, they'll engage. But so that's where you have to, as a grandparent, it's going to require a lot of thought of how do I take this conversation from surface level boringness to something that's really, that they're going to feed off of, that's going to get them turning and have this dinner conversation that they're not getting anywhere else. It's a great opportunity. It's an alley-oop for us, really, that we can sit down and say, there's this space that I can interact with this youth who that doesn't have this type of interaction. So it's really a great opportunity because the world they're a mile wide and an inch deep on everything. It's all very quick, it's non-substantial, but if you can get a kid talking about the deeper things, they're all for it because we all want to know that. We all want to know why we do things. We all want to know what is going on, why I'm responding this way, what happened here, what is going on? Is there something wrong with me? We all have these thoughts that need to be answered, but there's no platform generally for those conversations to take place because, again, I can get on my phone and disengage. And so...
Well, symbolism replaced words like, dislike, emojis. Mm-hmm. And we've introduced such brevity into our communication that teenagers already had one-word answers or grunts to questions. So to answer your question, Lindsay, I think in part, never ask a yes or no question, ever. And never ask one question at a time. Give me 3 things that happened today that you think really made you stop and think about something. And they're forced to have to answer your question with more than a yes, no, or a grunt. So we have conditioned ourselves to just find the least way of communicating. Even a symbol would be great instead of the words. And I know how you love words. So I think that's important. Thinking, first of all, it won't happen if we don't have time. If you don't have time, you don't have a shot. You only can, and we've talked about this in here, you can preserve your thoughts for another time when they may be more receptive. You can preserve your legacy. You can speak into their life later when you're not around and they're more receptive. We hope. But it does take time. Another thing is really important. You know your sons and daughters as parents better than anyone. School your grandchildren how to talk to their parents based on the fact that you raised them and you know what works and doesn't. Mm-hmm. And give them this feeling that they're actually doing something that might even be fun. How can I get dad to talk? How can I get him to admit he's wrong? How can I, whatever. And you know the answer to that because you raised them. We've got to start thinking really differently how we approach this whole subject.
So trick of the trade from teaching I learned. So I taught English, which is literally trying to teach critical thought. But the biggest mistake teachers and parents make is wait time. So we are very uncomfortable in silences. and we know the answer. So we ask a question, and then we get uncomfortable and we start talking. And that, if you can suffer through a 5-minute silence, they're also uncomfortable and they're going to want to talk. And so, but they're going to let you talk if you're going to talk. And so, and I've seen that in all my classrooms. And I tell them on day one, I would say, look, well, I'll sit here for 15 minutes. Someone's answering this, and it's not me. And as you do that, it's giving them a voice and saying, I actually care what you have to say so much that I'm going to shut up. I'm going to stop talking. And so that is a great tool that you can use. And you're going to have to get your spouse or whoever else is in the room to get on board, because it's going to go crazy in them too, and they're going to want to speak. But that is a huge tool that, when engaging and trying to get beyond yes and no, is just stop talking after a question and let it sit. And if it's scripture, that's great, because the word of God never comes back void. So just let that lion roar around in them,
Here's another tip. Schedule, for non-relational communicative teenagers, schedule time for talk. This helps because I've counseled with kids that are going through divorce, and it's a horrific thing for the whole entire family. And you have to do one of two things. You have to give it a boundary so it doesn't engulf their entire life, and their whole life's about the crisis. So you take a couple of kids and their mom, and you say, all right, 3 times a week for 20 minutes, we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about our family situation. And there's no excuse for not talking, because you've had basically 3.5 days in which to prepare for a 20-minute conversation. So we're going to talk about how you feel, what's going on, what do you have questions about, and everyone's prepared. The spontaneity that's necessary for an adolescent sometimes they're not there to all of a sudden shift gears and start talking. So sometimes you got to intentionally schedule it and plan for it, and then do it. And I hate to say you have to go to that length, but it's true. And come to think of it, I think my wife has to go to that length with me sometimes. All right, we're going to sit down, we're going to talk about this tonight, right? So I can't walk in there and go, duh, I had no idea. What are you talking about? So anyway, it takes a lot of thought. All right, anyone else got a last comment, question?
Mm-hmm.
But to encourage her, I said, what are we going to do? Well, maybe a little monetary value. So that seemed to work pretty good. So now, we got one thing so far. But I just think that that's such an important, I'm sure there's students.
Yep.
No, that's a great comment. Yes. Right.
What are you doing about Snapchat? Mm-hmm. So I'm still parenting my adult children, and in the long run, that's going to benefit my grandchildren, because long distance, it's very difficult. And, even though we FaceTime and all of that, so just asking your adult children, what do you think about gender identity? Can you verbalize to me why you believe what you believe? Mm-hmm. And getting them the tools, getting the rust off of their critical thinking, so that then they're more likely to engage with their children, because they're spending so much more time with them than I am.
Sure.
So whether I like to be past parenting, you're never done. You're just never done.
Isn't it fascinating the speed in which our culture is changing? Technology is changing fast, but the speed of ideals and principles and values and morals or lack thereof. It's almost like at a breakneck pace, really. I don't know if you knew this or not, but marijuana is no longer a drug. So don't use that phrase. And prescription drugs, as you know, are very prevalent. And kids are swapping their own ADHD medicine with one another. I mean, there's all kind of stuff going on. Anyway, God is on the throne. Hallelujah. And he's sovereign. And pray for our youth ministry and our youth minister in Kelsey. It's a tough road to hoe. Okay, let's close in prayer. Lord, we need wise like serpents and gentle like doves. We don't need to be out of touch and naive and ill-informed and irrelevant, but give us that mantle of encouragement, exhortation, of binding our children and grandchildren to their identity in you and to the family, to history, to a legacy, to a calling, to something of meaning and purpose. And show us how, Lord, to place the right boundaries and protection around our children and grandchildren. This is tough, getting tougher by the moment. Help us in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, thanks, y'all.